Okay, let's look at the types of variation. There are two types, namely continuous variation and discontinuous variation. The first one, continuous variation, is the variation in which differences in the characteristic is not distinct. Tidak ketara dia punya perbezaan ciri-ciri itu. So individuals show gradual differences in characteristics from one extreme to the other extreme. So you can see here from this graph, from this extreme of height to the other extreme of this height, so there are some gradual differences. If data is obtained and plotted on a graph, we will get a normal distribution as shown here in this figure, or we call it as the bell-shaped curve, where most members of the populations, they have intermediate phenotypes, which are characteristics found in between these two extremes. So continuous variation is quantitative, related to number, meaning it can be measured, it can be graded from one extreme to the other extreme. And the characteristics are influenced by environmental factors. So the picture here shows the examples of continuous variation. Okay, for example, height, okay, body weight, skin color. So you can see from here there are gradual differences and the characteristics doesn't show distinct differences. The second type is discontinuous variation, where it shows distinct differences in the characteristics. Which means if we are to obtain data and to plot it on a graph, there is a discrete distribution or a bar chart with separate bars, okay, like this. Okay, for example, this is graph of discontinuous variation showing different number of individuals against the blood group. So no intermediate characteristics. Okay, so the characteristics is qualitative, meaning cannot be measured or graded because these characteristics can only be determined by genetic factor and it is not influenced by environmental factors. Occurrence of this discontinuous variation is due to genetic factors, as we have mentioned just now, therefore it can be inherited. The characteristics is determined by single gene with 2 or 3 alleles. Therefore, the characteristics is easily seen. Okay, so here showing this picture shows the examples of discontinuous variation. For example, whether one can roll their tongue or cannot roll their tongue. Okay, the eye color and also the fingerprint pattern, whether it is looped, it is arched like this, or it is whole. Okay, a total of 8% to 10% of human population worldwide has blue eyes, okay, which is caused by a low level of melanin content in the outer layer of the iris. So melanin is the pigment that gives the eye dark color or black color. But because of this low level of melanin content, therefore the eyes appears to be blue. Okay, so this figure shows the comparison between continuous and discontinuous variation. First, let's look into the similarity, where these two types of variation shows differences in characteristics among the individuals of the same species. Okay, let's look at the differences for continuous variation. Okay, it will be much easier if you remember the examples. Therefore, you can compare the differences easily. You can remember it easily. For example, if it is continuous variation, example, height characteristics. So there is no obvious differences in the characteristics. Okay, but for discontinuous variation, it is the other way around, where there is obvious and also distinct differences in the characteristics. Okay, next one is that there is presence of intermediate characteristics, because just now we see gradual differences from one extreme to the other. But for discontinuous variation, no intermediate characteristics. In terms of the types of the types of graph, for continuous variation, it is graph with normal distribution, remember? That is the bell-shaped curve. But for discontinuous variation, they are discrete bars. Okay, discrete bars. Continuous variation, the characteristic is controlled by many genes. But for discontinuous variation, it is controlled by a single gene with 2 or 3 alleles. Okay, next one is for continuous variation, example like height and also weight, it is influenced by environmental factors. For example, if the person eats too much, overeating, therefore the weight he or she will put on weight lah, or the height might be taller as compared to the other person who is not having enough food. Okay, but for discontinuous variation, the characteristics are not influenced by environmental factors. Okay, it is only by genetic factors, for example, the blood group type. Okay, last difference is on the continuous variation. The characteristics can be measured, so we call it as quantitative, related to number. But for discontinuous variation, we cannot measure the characteristics, so we call it, there's the term called qualitative.